Hi, good morning and good afternoon. I hope that everyone is enjoying the first ever virtual Federal GIS conference. My name is Emily Swenson, and I'm a senior account manager and the nonprofit program lead here at Esri. I'm also your host for today's session on the Sustainable Development Goals and the geospatial framework, partnerships, and collaboration necessary to achieve them. Before we dive in, some quick housekeeping. The session will be an hour in length, with the last 15 minutes reserved for question and answer with the panelists. You're welcome to include questions and comments in the chat throughout the session, as there are moderators standing by to take them and return answers in the chat or curate some of the biggest questions and common themes to pose to panelists live at the end. The session will be recorded and posted in the virtual conference portal within 24 hours. I know there's several sessions going on at this time that folks had to choose between. So if you find this as inspiring as I expect, make sure your colleagues know that they too can access it in the coming days through the event portal. With that, I will go ahead and kick us off. So in the year 2015, all countries in the world signed on to achieve the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs provide a blueprint for achieving a more sustainable world for future generations, and with the objective of achieving specific goals and indicators by the year 2030. In this session, we're going to explore how various stakeholder groups are working to achieve the SDGs by confronting issues from food insecurity to racial inequity, and applying the power of GIS to develop local to global solutions, share information, and champion global responsibility. I'm now going to turn it over to some of those stakeholders to explore both progress and necessary future action from the local to the global scale. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Ross Comstock with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation.
Thank you, Emily, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So my role on this panel is to paint the big picture, to answer some of the big picture questions you might have. Questions like, what are the Sustainable Development Goals? What do we mean when we talk about a framework for sustaining our world? How can we connect local, community-based change efforts to the global goals? And how can this framework catalyze action and accelerate progress toward the goals? But before I do that, I want to share a few words about the Kellogg Foundation. The Kellogg Foundation was founded in 1930 by breakfast cereal entrepreneur Will Keith Kellogg and is one of the nation's top private foundations. Children are at the center of all that we do. We envision a world where all children thrive. WKKF is committed to ensuring all children, families, and communities, regardless of race or income, have opportunities to reach their full potential. We have three interconnected priorities: thriving children, working families, and equitable communities, and racial equity cuts across to all of our work. As we all know, our people and our planet face many tough challenges. These challenges cannot be addressed by a single organization. If we want to build a better world, we need to work together. These challenges will require collaboration on an unprecedented scale. To succeed, we will need to connect and enable broad networks of change makers across many sectors. I want you to remember that too, many sectors, including government, nonprofits, philanthropy, business, academia, and engaged citizens. This reflects the reality of how change happens. In my slides, I'm going to refer to the cross-sector collective of individuals and organizations broadly as change makers. So when I say change makers, I want you to think of the multi-sector change makers. And I believe we can be optimistic. The world is really coming together to take on these challenges. So as Emily shared, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, bring the big challenges into focus. In 2015, UN member states came together and all UN member states agreed on 17 specific goals. And if you drill down into those goals, there's 169 very specific targets. The SDGs reflect our global challenges with issues such as poverty and hunger and health, education, climate, peace, and inequality. The last goal, the one that you see in the bottom right, goal number 17, is titled Partnerships for the Goals. So in some ways, what we're sharing with you here today is an evolving partnership in support of the goals. And I want to draw your attention to SDG 10 in the middle, the pink one. It's reduced inequalities. Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, said, there must be progress on SDG 10 for all other SDGs to succeed. Think about that for a minute. There must be progress on SDG 10 for all other SDGs to succeed. That's an important point. Inequality or inequities must be considered with each and every SDG. Okay, so the goals are clearly defined, but how can we work together to achieve the goals locally and globally? How can we connect, collaborate, manage data, and track progress towards the goals? And where does geospatial fit in? We're going to get into all of this in more detail. In a few minutes, you're going to hear from Greg Scott from the UN. We'll be telling you more about the IGIF, or the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework. I'll be showing you in these slides how the IGIF and Esri technology allows us to connect communities, nations, regions, and broadly our planet. And Celeste Connors will be showing you a stellar example of how the framework and tools can be used at a subnational level, in this case for the Aloha Challenge in Hawaii. The information we are sharing with you today builds on many years of good work by the UN, by Esri, and other partners. We want you to see that this is reasonably easy to do. So that's a key takeaway. We want you to view our slides in this presentation, hear from the panel, and realize that this stuff is doable, okay? Nations, states, and communities can do this. We're excited about this because we see the promise of this approach. So on to the framework. Let's talk about the framework. The framework is made up of 3 interdependent elements: governance, people, and technology. Within the UN, and Emily, you can go ahead and click. Thank you. Within the UN, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs has a special responsibility for the SDGs. As I mentioned, Greg Scott will be sharing more information about the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework, or IGIF. None of what we're talking about today would be possible without this foundational work. In fact, I want to highlight that again. These are interdependent. We need all 3 of these for this to work. I touched on the people aspect of this earlier. These are the change makers working together on change across many sectors. Also crucial is the leadership. For countries, this might be senior ministerial level leaders. And in the US, this might be federal, state, local leaders, governors, mayors, folks that maybe want to bring this to your state or community. And lastly, technology. We couldn't do this without geospatial technology and tools to support collaboration and knowledge and data sharing. The geospatial industry is built on an open and interoperable set of tools. Esri is at the center of that ecosystem. They have been for decades. It's amazing. Their system of systems approach and Esri hubs, you're going to hear more about Esri hubs, make this possible. You will get a sense of how hubs work and how they can be interconnected as we get deeper into our presentation. So when I try to explain this, I find that it's really helpful to share a visual of what the very top level might look like, or as they say, you know, the kind of classic starting with the end in mind. So what if we connect everything? What do we get to do? So here it is, the Living Atlas Vital Signs of the Planet. I want you to imagine this dashboard for our planet. Imagine a living atlas where we can see the vital signs of our planet. And that might be small on your screen, but you can see different measures like air quality and wildfire and coral bleaching and COVID measures and so forth. So when you imagine what is possible with all this rolled up data and knowledge, it illustrates the power, I think, of the SDGs. You can see a small colored square in the upper left corner of each dashboard indicator. That shows you how each measure connects back to a specific SDG. Esri is working on this. This is part of Esri CEO Jack Dangermond's bold vision, and really, I think, a philanthropic dream. He's a very philanthropic man. I think Esri is a very philanthropic company. of what is possible if we work together in support of the global goals. This is truly groundbreaking work. For the first time, we will be able to see the complex connections around the globe. In some ways, this will be a nervous system for our planet. I remember hearing many years ago, I was at a Net Hope conference, and I remember hearing that Jack Dangermond envisioned this as a possible kind of nervous system for the planet. So let's start to look at how this all fits together. Moving from left to right, we're going from the global level to the local level. On the left, you see the vital signs of the planet dashboard that we were just looking at, the living atlas of the world. This is made possible through global partnerships with amazing organizations and efforts, including the UN SDGs, which we're talking about here today, National Geographic, Half Earth, Moby, AI for Earth, and others. And I imagine over time that other global partners will join in, but get this sense that there are global partners involved in how this fits together. Then if we go to the next level, it's national or regional level geospatial hubs. Many of these hubs exist today. Others are being planned or added based on country readiness and a clear desire and commitment to participate. I mentioned the leadership earlier. That's the leadership piece that I mentioned, is that the leadership in countries or states or regions needs to come together and agree to do this. And as we move further to the right, we get to the community level hubs. In the upper right, you can think of geographic communities, because I have two meanings for communities here. Geography-based communities, traditional, the way that we think of communities. And at the Kellogg Foundation, we do a lot of work in communities. We have what we call our named priority places, and we're exploring the ability to bring these hubs into all of our places where we work, microregions in Mexico and Haiti, or Detroit or Albuquerque, the Navajo Nation, et cetera. Celeste, as I mentioned, will be sharing a wonderful example with the Aloha Challenge Hub. And in the lower right corner, you can see the issue-based or SDG specific hubs to support global communities of practice. Emily, if you want to click one more time, thank you. So those are like the issue-based hubs, and that's important. I want you to think of communities as not just geography-based, but issue-based too. So imagine that we could have a hub for poverty or climate or health or equity, one for each of the SDGs or big issue areas that are important around the globe, so that we can bring the global communities of practice together. Wouldn't it be amazing if there were templates for community hubs and a community could bring up their own geospatial hub within a few hours of work? We think that getting started should be that easy. That's something that we're talking about and thinking about. How can we make this super easy? Okay, and in closing, I want to share why this is important to the Kellogg Foundation. Remember, children are at the center of what we do. We want to help create a world where every child has the opportunity to thrive. We're exploring how we can better support our network of change makers working locally and globally on the SDG challenges. And as our founder, Will Keith Kellogg, said, it is only through cooperative planning, intelligent study, and group action, activities on the part of the entire community, that lasting results can be achieved. Lasting results is about sustainability. Mr. Kellogg was an innovator, and I believe he would have been excited about the prospect of a connected, collaborative geospatial infrastructure that helps communities work together on their most important goals. As we all work together toward achieving the SDGs by 2030, we are creating a better world for all of our children. That wraps up my big picture overview. And next up, we're going to go to Celeste Connors from Hawaii Green Growth, and she'll bring this down to earth in the beautiful state of Hawaii. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ross, for setting the stage for us all. With that, I would like to turn it over to our second panelist, Celeste Connors. Celeste, take it away.
Yes, aloha, everyone. I'm so delighted to be with all of you today and to actually share Hawaii's experience, which very much builds on what Ross was sharing, that it actually takes a collective effort to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals that are aspirational and critically important, especially against the backdrop of the devastating COVID pandemic and the need to build back more resilient, green, and equitable. And so what we'll be sharing with you today is an example of Hawaii's experience that can be applied more broadly in a locally and culturally appropriate way. And before I share more about this experience, I do want to highlight three really important aspects of what I'm going to share. First is the need for high-level political commitments and leadership at the highest level of government, whether it's local government, regional or national government. Second, it's the importance of public-private partnerships and stakeholders, the community that comes together that can carry this political commitment beyond short-term political cycles. And finally, it's the importance of measuring progress through the dashboard that actually provides accountability. So if we want to go to the first slide, Emily, this is an example, or this is the history of Hawaii green growth, which was actually established after the 2008 financial crisis and emerged from the 2011 US-hosted APEC Economic Cooperation Summit, APEC, in Honolulu. And what it was actually is this group emerged. It was from the OECD membership countries that agreed after the 2008 financial crisis that they needed to foster economic growth and development with a view to ensuring that natural assets continue to provide resources and support environmental services and our well-being upon which we rely. And this commitment was adopted by the APEC leaders in 2011. And it actually inspired a group of local leaders to come together and themselves commit to a green growth recovery. And that's the picture you see on the other side there of our local leaders, the governor, the legislature, our judiciary, all branches of government coming together for a local commitment for green growth recovery. If you go to the next slide, Emily, right here, this is really about islands inspiring other islands. Ross talked a little bit about these hubs and actually how the hubs are serving a particular purpose. Well, in Hawaii, we are an island economy. We were inspired by other leaders that came before us, the Micronesia Challenge and the Caribbean Challenge, that then led to the Aloha Plus Challenge in 2014, which was actually a U.S. commitment at the UN SIDS meeting in Apia, Samoa. And the initiative was announced by then Science Advisor John Holdren. The name Aloha Plus Challenge links this challenge to the others, including the Best Challenge in Europe. And if you go to the next slide, Emily, this is what our statewide sustainability framework is. The Aloha Plus Challenge, or He Nohona Ai Oia, is a statewide commitment to achieve Hawaii's statewide sustainability goals and serve as a local framework to achieve the UN SDGs. I have to say, critically important, Hawaii's framework was launched 1 year prior to the SDGs. And our priority areas include 100% clean energy, doubling local food production, managing waste, stewarding our natural resources, and smart sustainable communities and a green workforce and education. And if you go to the next slide, you can actually see an illustration of what Ross was talking about. This is the community. So Hawaii Green Growth is a public-private partnership. It is a network-based organization of over 150 public and private partners, institutions that are committed to catalyze action and build a more sustainable future for Hawaii. And this includes political commitments from the 4 county mayors, the governor, private sector, and civil society. And as a public-private partnership, it is our responsibility to steward this initiative, which we've now done through 2 governors and 6 mayors. And let me get to and this is just a snapshot of the partners I should mention. And let's get to the how, because process matters, and that would be in the next slide. Hawaii's model explicitly builds on a legacy of indigenous knowledge and systems thinking and island values that go back 1,000 years. Sustainability is not a new concept in Hawaii or in an island economy, which is essentially a circular economy. And our network and partnerships are committed to stewarding Hawaii's cultural, natural, and human resources by advancing social, economic, environmental goals. And in order to achieve this, we convene and we connect diverse partners. We engage in short-term consensus building toward long-term goals, which is critically important also as we think about the need to achieve our climate goals. And we measure progress on the dashboard, which we'll talk about in a bit, and we coordinate across all stakeholders to drive action. I mentioned earlier process matters, and so Emily, if you go to the next slide, I'll share a little bit about how we got to this point. Initially, after agreeing to the high-level goals, we spent 3 years convening our network across the islands in every county, in some cases with executives sitting shoulder to shoulder with county waste managers and those that were actually stewarding the aina, or the land, in Hawaii, to determine what matters to our community. So we needed to go into the community to determine what mattered to our community in order to start measuring progress. And we identified these shared metrics. And so the process for developing the indicators in the dashboard and the content around these 6 targets was, as we call, or sometimes describe metaphorically, as singing a song in a round. Strategically timed and sequenced approach that provided the opportunity to focus on each target while maintaining progress on the others to actually complete the dashboard. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll actually be able to see the dashboard that we're delighted to be working with Esri on. It's very compelling. We've had some of our political colleagues refer to this as the scoreboard. And each of our goals has a series of primary indicators, and we collaborate with our partners to continuously update and track progress. And you'll see that on the next slide here, Emily. This actually shows what our 6 priority areas are. And again, bottom up, grassroots driven, determined prior to the SDGs, which is informing progress against the SDGs, which you can actually see in this slide. If you go to the next slide, we're actually really delighted again to be part of this conversation, that our dashboard was successfully migrated to the Esri platform at the end of 2020 last year. And since then, with our partnership with Esri, the Aloha Plus Challenge Hub is now featured in the ArcGIS Gallery, along with partner hubs, including Ireland, with which we work very closely. So the commitment to changing behavior through our community first is how we're envision paving the way for other islands and communities to be empowered through local partnerships to scale their global efforts. And if you carry on to the next slide, Emily, you'll actually see one other slide about the process and methodology. Also, as a former government official, I do appreciate the importance of process to drive policy and action. And as you can see here, we continuously convene across 6 working groups, including our measures working group to determine the best available data that we have, our next gen working group to get leaders, young leaders involved, our policy and legislative working group, and all of these develop specific concrete actions. We convene over 50 meetings a year to actually ensure success. And finally, the next slide, if you go further, I just want to make a note about ESG, that our businesses are involved. We convene a sustainability business forum as part of our network with 26 of our CEOs from Hawaii's publicly traded companies and privately held companies. They have not only made a commitment to the SDGs and to the Aloha Plus Challenge, but they see this alignment with the ESG, Environment Social Governance reporting framework that is emerging as really critically important when we look at the business sector's commitment and contribution to recovering from the COVID crisis. And they are being tracked on the dashboard to show their commitment publicly. And if you go to the next slide, you can see how this actually applies in action here, Emily. When COVID hit, our partners came to us and said, we need to get on a better recovery pathway, not one only focused on a particular sector, in our case, tourism. So we actually ran a survey statewide, identified over 9,000 green jobs, how much that would cost. We were able to display it on the dashboard. And our governor actually mentioned that the UN SDGs, to quote, provide a framework for our recovery and insurance against future shocks. And this is critically important, as science tells us we have 10 years to change the trajectory, to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change, which is going to require behavior change across every sector of our society. So if I'll quickly just go through the last couple of slides here. As a result of our efforts, we were recognized by the United Nations as a Local 2030 hub. And the Local 2030 initiative is a really interesting initiative launched by the United Nations in recognition that local action and innovation is required to achieve the global goals. And so we're delighted to be one of the first Local 2030 hubs to support local leadership and island leadership. And this is a cross-UN system initiative to help communities identify their priorities with respect to the UN SDGs and implement innovative solutions to address local needs. If you go to the next 2 slides, I would just like to note that as part of our commitment, we are actually working with other island economies as a network, as the Local 2030 Island Network, which brings together a diverse set of island nations and states. And finally, if I go to the final slide here, because I do want to get to our colleagues and discussion, this has all really come together last year, a couple months ago. Hawaii launched a 2020 benchmark report. And this was to demonstrate that we are sitting on at least 6 years of data from when we launched the Aloha Plus Challenge. We pulled this data together, working with our partners to actually provide baseline data, 2020 baseline data against which we can mark our recovery. This report also serves as Hawaii's voluntary local review. Ross talked earlier about the SDGs. When nations commit to achieve the SDGs, they commit to also reporting on progress through a voluntary national review. And now we see local government leaders and communities taking the lead by actually reporting on their voluntary local review and their local progress. And so we are happy to say that we launched the first statewide voluntary local review, which includes commitments from our 4 county mayors, our governor, private sector, and civil society. And this really builds on a legacy of other communities, including New York and LA and Helsinki and those around the world that have taken leadership on this, and including island economies in the Pacific in particular. So with that, I want to just stop and say that we're happy to engage in a conversation. This is not easy, the work at the community level, but it's very rewarding. And we need to connect local action across the world to achieve these global goals. So with that, thank you very much, and aloha.
Thank you so much, Celeste. It's so exciting to see this work being brought to life and local action catalyzed in the island state of Hawaii. So thank you. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our final presenter, which is Mr. Greg Scott with United Nations Statistics Division. Take it away, Greg.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily, and thank you, Ross and Celeste. You've made my job very, very easy. Not only have you demonstrated what and how enabling frameworks and technologies can support the implementation of the SDGs and sustaining our world, you've actually been very inspirational in doing it. So you've made my job very, very easy. What I'd like to just do is to close this discussion in our 3 presentations is expand a little bit more on why it's so important, and doing so through a geospatial lens, a lens that really is about thinking globally and acting locally, as both Celeste and Ross have mentioned, to address our many, many challenges that we have. So if we just go to the first slide, if we can, Emily, is about some of the context. Context here is that, to the point of our discussion, global to local. While there are a number of global development agendas that have been universally adopted by all countries, and we've talked a lot about the 2030 agenda and the SDGs, there are others. There's the climate agreement, the Sendai framework, the Samoa pathway for small island developing states, the habitat agreement on the urban agenda, and oceans agreements, etc., etc. Many global agendas over the 2014 to 2017 period, but the key one is the SDGs, which provides that overarching development framework for all of our global development. That said, they need to be implementable and visible to all citizens. This dimension is often lost in the detail when we think about the SDGs. Many global development challenges, particularly pertaining to socioeconomic development and equity, are intrinsically tied to what happens where at the local level, cities, communities, with citizens. Therefore, it's really important that governments, national governments, local, state, are key actors in translating this global vision of the SDGs into local action at the community level. I just want to remind you of that. This action at the community level is really, really important. And if we now just go to the next slide, is an element to this. Being able to implement and deliver on the SDGs is complex. It fundamentally needs data, and especially location data, particularly when we get to that local level, because it is the source of where things are happening and why they're happening where they are happening. And this is why the need to significantly increase the availability of high quality, timely and reliable data that's disaggregated to local levels including through geographic location, is fundamental to the 2030 agenda. It's hardwired into the 2030 agenda. It has terms that are hardwired to exploit the contribution to be made by a wide range of data, including Earth observations, geospatial information, and other data. But more importantly, it's also asking or bringing urgency to address the needs of the developing countries first. Not only first, but by 2020, and that time period has already passed. So there's a sense of urgency on what we need to be able to achieve. But as we go to the next slide, we've hit a new normal, and it's already been captured by Ross and Celeste. As if we didn't have enough challenges and enough time pressures, we've now got COVID-19 consuming our world as it is at the moment. As it continues, this pandemic has realized a number of fragilities. It's exacerbated our world's vulnerabilities within and among countries. It's exposed long-term fragility and vulnerability, particularly for the poorest and the most vulnerable people. And it's reinforced a number of pre-existing obstacles to realizing the SDGs. Now, in today's world, we are all interconnected and we are all affected. We know that. We're living it as we are at this time. So sustainable and resilient recovery from the pandemic will require a more integrated approach to sustainable development. It's emphasized the importance and critical nature of sustainable development itself. So as we go to the next slide, this is where I believe a geospatial lens provides us with hope and opportunity. And we do have a lot of hope and opportunity, as already been demonstrated, not the least being the opportunity to leverage enabling frameworks and technologies. Leveraging digital transformation for the SDGs is enabling us to involve this data ecosystem towards a system of systems with data, with enabling technology, with governance, with people, and as Celeste also mentioned, with processes. So for example, as we cascade from the left to the right on these slides, we have at the global, at a uniform technology level that Esri has implemented, a data hubs. Within the UN system, we've developed SDG data hubs, and they are now being implemented and rolled out at country level to report on the SDGs. But what that capability and that technology has enabled us to do very, very quickly is to translate those hubs and that architecture into COVID-19 hubs and dashboards. And some of the least developed countries in the world have been able to do that and reporting their situations into their decision makers within countries. So that enabling technology and digital transformation provides us with a lot of opportunity. To the next slide. In terms of frameworks, and Ross has mentioned the IGIF, the Integrated Geospatial Framework, and I won't touch on this too much, but in essence, it was developed by the United Nations and the World Bank and has been adopted by all countries as a framework for the world. It's multidimensional. It's aimed at strengthening national geospatial information management in countries, particularly developing countries. And if we just go to the next click, Emily, is that it comprises three key components: an overarching strategy from local to global, implementation guidance, and even country level action plans. So it goes from very high level to very detailed. For this presentation, I'll just stick to the strategic overview itself. And on this next slide, what you can see is the overarching framework, the vision, the mission, the strategic drivers and principles and goals that really underpin the requirements and the objectives of the IGIF. Importantly, the IGIF is linked to drivers, national to global strategic drivers. So it's an enabling framework that isn't about doing things for the sake of doing things. It's doing things to bring about change, transformation change, based on the national needs and drivers. And importantly, it is driven by leadership. And so if we go to the next slide, which is really the action of the IGIF itself, and Ross touched on this when he mentioned governance, the technology, and the people. The IGIF is anchored by 9 strategic pathways. And these really are the pathways for bringing about change. When we think about leadership, the governance and institutions pathway is inherently relying on leadership. Partnerships, as Celeste has also mentioned, are critically important. The people components are critically important. The technology through the middle, the data, the innovation, the standards, are things we're used to, but it's how we bring around the governance and the people to enable outcome and change from the local to the global level and vice versa. So looking at the next slide, if we just have a look at an application of this, the United Kingdom's geospatial strategy, unlocking the power of location, if we just click again, Emily, is underpinned by the IGIF. Their location data framework is underpinned by the IGIF, and a number of countries are now using that to anchor their national strategies and to bring about a lot of this change. But to the next slide, what does this mean in terms of bringing it all together when we think about the needs of the SDGs and the need for communities to be able to disseminate SDG data in a meaningful way, to be able to leverage a systems of systems approach and to be able to apply it to our challenges? So it's about frameworks and it's about technologies. And so if we just look on the left-hand slide, Emily, if you just click once more, we have enabling technologies. And what they're able to let us do now is a lot more than we have in the past. They're scalable, they're interoperable, they connect, they are open, they enable citizens and users to have access. And importantly, they rely on a system of systems approach. To the next slide, we can then bring those together with our frameworks. And so an SDG Data Alliance is what we're developing that's serving the needs of the SDGs at a local level, from global to local, but using enabling technologies and frameworks to be able to bring this together. And this is what's happening. And Ross and Celeste have demonstrated this prior to actually looking at the frameworks that can support that. And I'm very excited on how this is working. And now with the United Nations, the Kellogg Foundation, the Aloha Challenge, Esri, and others, we're looking at developing this SDG Data Alliance to leverage technology, governance, people, and process. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg. And thank you to all presenters. We're about to move into the question and answer session or portion of today's session. And I first just wanted to say that from an Esri perspective, I've watched this work evolve over the years and believe we're at a better place than ever and a much more necessary place than ever to be coming together around the SDGs and this framework to advance them. So thank you for this inspirational session. I guess I can go ahead and stop sharing my screen while we go ahead and grab some questions from the chat here. Okay, so something that I noticed in each of your sessions, each of your presentations, is alluding to the challenges and setbacks that we're facing as a global society from COVID-19. And I wanted to ask each of you how you see recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic as connected to advancing the SDGs. Could I ask Celeste to take the first shot at responding to that question?
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And that's an excellent question and really the question of the day and critically important. The SDGs actually provide an existing framework for recovery. They are comprehensive. They include the critical things that are important for recovery, dealing with equity, resilience, addressing the future threat of climate change, actually, which will be significant if we don't take action, and how we localize that to connect with local government priorities is actually equally critically important. I mentioned Hawaii Green Growth is actually based on the Green Growth Economic Plan that OECD countries and APEC economies agreed to in 2011. So it was even recognized then that the pathway that we're on was not actually sustainable. And now you've got this comprehensive, globally aligned framework, again, that needs to be locally and culturally appropriate to place. And so that's actually what the challenge is, understanding what are the priorities of the community, not just in what you'd be measuring, but also of our local elected officials and of our local business leaders, because each place is unique, but can be connected again to this global framework. In the case of Hawaii and other island economies that we're working with, we experienced massive disruption as a result of COVID in the form of tourism disruption. That was actually the driver of our economy. We went from having the lowest unemployment to the highest unemployment in the nation almost overnight. And what it does is actually highlights we do need to build back better. We do need to look at diversifying our economy. And again, this is found in the SDG framework, and in our case, the Aloha Plus Challenge framework, where we're talking about green workforce and education. We're looking at the need to bridge the gap and focus on digital equity and access, because COVID has actually exposed that our most vulnerable communities are those that are most affected by the pandemic. And so, it's instead of needing to recreate the wheel, I think we actually need to look at what we have ahead of us, because we don't actually have that much time to reflect on this. We have the tools in the toolkit, and it's about applying that. And it's about having the conversation and critically having the political leadership to really execute on some of these difficult decisions. So I think it's all there. And these conversations are actually going to get us there faster.
Thank you, Celeste. Greg, is there anything that you would add to that?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really critical point, and I think some of the observations that we've seen, and certainly the UN is doing a lot of work now to support countries as to how they may recover from COVID, and a lot of this is a socio-economic recovery process. I think there's 2 points I'd like to make. Is that the positive of this is that the recovery of the pandemic at the same time advances improvement or implementation of the SDGs. So as we recover from the pandemic and think about some of those situations in countries, it also progresses to a degree the implementation of the SDGs. The second point I'd like to make is that with the pandemic, the whole world is in this together. And many developed countries around the world address the SDGs in different ways. So it was seen by some as being, well, that's really for the developing world, a bit like the Millennium Development Goals, and we'll just pay token service to the SDGs. Whereas now, I think the pandemic has realized our global connectivity and interconnectivity, and the vulnerabilities, and to a degree the points of failure that we have in that interconnectiveness, and that we need to improve our resilience. But in doing so, it's not so much about how we do it in isolation. It's more about how we do it together. And I think that's making a big difference, or will make a big difference once we recover more from this into how we think forward, rather than looking backwards on this once it's passed.
Great. Thank you, Greg. And something that you all have touched on across these presentations is the significance, the importance of locally relevant solutions. And there's been some really powerful language that I've heard Ross use before around community-based goals. And Ross, if I could ask you to expand on that idea, what do you mean by community-based goals, and how does that connect to the global SDGs?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that we actually saw that in Celeste's slides when she talked about the Aloha Challenge. She noted that actually they had started a year or so ahead of the SDGs, and they came together locally in communities. They worked with community members. They brought all voices to the table, which is crucially important. You've got to get all perspectives together and talk about what are the local goals in that community? What are important to the people that live here? And I would contrast that with the notion of folks coming in from the outside and saying, this is what should be important in this particular geographic place. It's really essential that it's locally driven. And I've got a quote here from some work that we've been doing, and I think it captures it beautifully. Local knowledge and culture. This is not a top-down or outside-in effort. Local communities, drawing on local knowledge and local culture, know what is best to achieve the SDGs in their communities. They determine locally and culturally appropriate action and what needs to be measured and how. And I think that sums it up beautifully.
Thank you, Ross. And this ties into one of the questions we've received in the chat here that I'd like to prompt Celeste with, which is, with one of the focus points of the SDGs being providing services to underrepresented areas of society, how have engagement programs to solicit buy-in from these underrepresented areas been pursued, and what have been the results? So if you could speak to that with your work in Hawaii.
Absolutely, Emily. And before I address that, I want to riff a little bit on Ross said, particularly in a community like Hawaii that has had a very vibrant cultural renaissance. And as I mentioned before, has a deep 1,000-year-long history of systems thinking, and something that we call the ahupua'a, or the watershed. If you grow up on an island, you inherently understand that what you do in your upper watershed will affect your coral reef and the communities in between. And so it's really important, if we want to see a successful implementation of the SDGs, is to do what Ross had mentioned here, is to look at this from engaging first the local communities and understanding that in the case of Hawaii, we maintain a population of up to 1 million people, comparable to today's population prior to European contact, through sustainable resource management. And so now we are looking at food dependency challenges and the need to get more resilient on food production, on energy. And so it's both a hopeful message, but one that we need to listen and actually to recognize that. And that ties directly into our underserved communities in Hawaii, which are often our indigenous community, our Native Hawaiian community, and how they are actually not just part of the conversation, that they're leading the conversation. When you think about the goals, and in the case of Hawaii, where we have these very ambitious goals of doubling local food, of 100% clean energy by 2045, by addressing a housing crisis, you'll quickly see the goals bump into each other. And really this comes down to trade-offs. And I think it's not a challenge that we should shy away from. It's actually the importance of having the conversation to understand what those trade-offs might be in these particular cases. And so it's actually very important that we do look at affordable housing for our community, that we do engage the community on where and what kinds of clean energy solutions they want to see in their community, and what is the priority. So what we do as a network of networks is that we work with our other network-based organizations that are working deeply in communities in particular areas. And one example of a partner organization is KUA, which literally in Hawaiian means backbone. And they serve as a backbone organization for fish ponds, that there have been a restoration of fish ponds around Hawaii, which is providing food and resilience and resources for our community. And so we work with organizations like that. So in a sense, we have to be smart, we have to be efficient, we can't do everything. So networks are very important. Networks of networks are important to actually get that community voice into the conversation early and often.
Thank you, Celeste. You speak to the significance, the importance of networks and partnerships to advancing the goals. And I'd like to pose this question to Ross. Who is on the hook for working together to achieve the goals? What are the crucial partnerships that we need to advance?
Well, I think back to the slide that I showed with a diagram of, let's look at some of the big partnerships here that it begins with. I mean, the UN setting up a framework with the World Bank, the IGIF, and so forth. But then it takes a lot of other leaders to plug in. And I think one way that I like to say it is, think of it as almost like a potluck. It's like, who has what that they can bring here in the spirit of collaboration? What can we do together that we couldn't possibly do separately, right? And so I work for the Kellogg Foundation. So philanthropy, that's one of the things that we think about is, how can we be most helpful? One of the things that I think that we bring to it is that we support these big networks of change makers around the world working in health or education. So, humbly, I think that's what we bring to the table is we can bring the network of change makers and also kind of back to our vision and how we think about things. We have something we call our DNA. And that's racial equity, community engagement, and leadership. That's an approach to the way that we do our work, this racial equity lens. And so I want to make clear that when we talk about partnerships, how important it is that we literally bring all voices to the table. You have to reach out to all the underserved groups and bring all the folks together to talk about how are we going to do this together. So partnerships must be thought of through a racial equity lens.
Thank you. I love that notion of a potluck and drawing on the strengths of each of these partners. Thank you, Ross. Greg, I'll pose this to you. This is in the chat. So while government agencies establish and execute policies, they also own and manage facilities and infrastructure, consume energy and water, and protect flora and fauna. How can these agencies best develop programs to establish and achieve agency-specific SDGs?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's an old adage, but a lot of this does come down to leadership. I think in doing some of these things, and even when we think about the actions that agencies have, particularly those that are dealing with infrastructure and services, whether it be physical infrastructure, but health services and others, is the policy is being able to manage the policy with the action on the ground, but at the same time understanding the public good or the social good is incredibly important. And so one of the things that we've been learning over the last few years within our intergovernmental process with the UN is creating, I guess, a table, a bit like Ross was talking about the potluck. We call it bringing everyone to the table in terms of convening power. And the key element to this is the fact that it's an old adage we use when we established an intergovernmental process for GGIM was governments can't do it alone, and nor can industry, and nor can others. And it's about us having to do all of this together. And it's a recognition of how we contribute to those pieces of the whole and what that role looks like, but also the benefit, the value, and the proposition that goes with that is going to be incredibly important. And that is often not well articulated.
Thanks, Greg. And I have another question for you while you're speaking that came in through the chat. The question is, I noticed a lot of talk about implementation of SDGs for LDCs and developing nations. To what extent is the UN encouraging self-actualization in these areas to achieve these goals, whether through technical capacity building or leadership?
Yeah, so in the area that I work in, and I'm a geographer, I work in geospatial information primarily. One of the big objectives that we've had, and the UN's becoming much better at this, is about capacity building and implementation. So if we use the IGIF as an example, we spent 2 or 3 years developing that framework, but then we spent 18 months with countries, 133 countries, looking at capacity building. We do a lot of training and development with developing countries. But the big challenge we have with all of that is that it's easy to go in and teach, but it's a lot more difficult for them to be taught and then walk and do their own walking. And that's a key element. It's not easy because it's time consuming, and it requires a lot of resources to do that. But that's really one of the ambitions that we've been looking at in the geospatial sector, is being able to walk the walk rather than just talk the talk. And the beauty that we have there, no matter where you are in different parts of the world, is that when we speak with geospatial practitioners and geospatial scientists, they understand this. Geographers understand a lot of this, and it's about how we enable them and give them the tools, because they've got the skills that are needed, and it's how we best can do that. And that's and to be honest, that's the struggle we've had in the last year with the pandemic, but it's also been the advantage, because it's developed capability with technology a lot quicker than we may have otherwise seen.
Great, thank you, Greg. In the final minutes here, I'd like to go around and ask each of you to respond to this question, that is, are the SDGs still achievable by the year 2030? And how will geospatial play a role in that? I'll start with Celeste.
Yes, I am a pragmatic optimist, and it's not necessarily even a question of if they can be achieved, it's that we have to achieve them. And in a sense, they're moonshot goals. We don't always know how we're going to do it. And this is why these conversations are important. This is why partnerships with Esri are important. And on a personal note, previously in government, before Rio Plus 20, I remember working with Esri and how to envision what a future could look like. And so now I find myself, having worked at the federal level, working at the local level, and really seeing how critically important it is to bridge that gap and the critical role that Esri can play in that, and GIS. But I would say it's an imperative that we actually look at these goals as something we need to achieve. It's what the science is telling us we need to do. And it's about behavior change at the end of the day, Emily. And we need wide-scale behavior change. In our case, the dashboards, we think, can actually help contribute to that. They can actually allow each individual to see what their contribution can be to increasing efficiency, reducing waste, help them make the decisions that they are empowered to make about transportation and purchasing, and then to see how those individual actions are actually connected to, say, statewide action, regional action, global action. So they need to be achieved, and they can be, and it's a question of how, which will work out together.
Great answer. Ross.
Yeah, I'm also an optimist, so I'm going to say yes as well. And I think the secret really is the ability to, in the diagram that I shared, how all those nations and communities and regions can be connected together. Because I think the key to accelerating the pace of positive change is sharing what works and what doesn't work. So that notion of sharing what's working in communities and having it be transferred to other communities is, I think, crucial. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Greg, for the last question of the session today, do you believe the SDGs are still achievable?
I'm an optimistic realist, but I do what I do because I do believe, and I guess the other answer to that is that the SDGs, like the Millennium Development Goals, are they achievable? It's really subjective and it's personal, and it really does come down to what we're trying to do for our future and our children's future. I now have a grandson, and it's about the future. If we don't have, the other question is, if we don't have the SDGs, what do we do? And this is really what it's about. We've got a decade to make change. I believe we will make change. Whether we actually say we've delivered on the SDGs is not really relevant. It's the journey, it's the progress, and it's that evolution of development and ensuring that no one's left behind. That's going to be absolutely critical. And the idea is that we continue to leave the world in a better shape than it is when we got to it. And this is really the key element to it. They provide us with the focus, but it's up to us to look at how we turn that into some sort of reality.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg, for leaving us with that final bit of optimism. Thank you, everyone, for joining this session today. I'd like to point folks toward our Esri Sustainable Development Twitter, which is Esri_nonprofit. We'll be sharing the Hawaii Green Growth Hub link there, as well as some other resources we mentioned in today's session. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and let's continue working together, everyone.